So, I would like to introduce our presenter this morning, Dr. Pamela Pike. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Pike. You can imagine all the warm applause from the different homes of our piano teachers in Alberta. We're thrilled to have you with us. Dr. Pamela Pike is the Herndon Spillman Professor of Piano Pedagogy and Associate Dean for Research, Creative Activity, and Community Engagement in the College of Music and Dramatic Arts at Louisiana State University. She has extensive experience teaching piano to students of all ages, both privately and in group settings. And there's a lot of really fascinating information about her in her biography. I'm not going to read all of it today, but you did receive it in your email. So please go have a look at that. And also maybe check out the piano magazine that she is a part of, another great resource for piano teachers. And maybe I'll let you tell us just a smidge about getting connected with that if our teachers aren't already at the end, if that's okay, Dr. Pike. Awesome. Well, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter now. And as I said, feel free to interact in the chat. I will be watching the chat. So if you put a question in there and you don't hear it answered right away, don't worry. I will cycle back to it and make sure that we get those questions answered by the end of our time together this morning. So thank you so much. Welcome to Presenting to APTA.
Thank you, Chelsea. And thank you for working behind the scenes to keep us all on track. So the other thing I will say right now is, of course, technology being what it is, my internet is showing as unstable this morning, and it's been fine all along. So if I start getting very garbly, Chelsea will just stop me and I will move myself out closer to my router, which is at my piano, but a little less comfortable for me. So I thought I would try to sit in my home office and be a little more comfortable today. Also, as Chelsea said, please feel free to post any questions in the chat, certainly comments, because we all learn from each other. And I will try to save some time for questions at the end as well. But if there's something that's really pressing, because it is Friday and, I may think I've said something that I haven't, just feel free to pop it in the chat and I will either answer it immediately or get to it as soon as I can.
That
So
sounds great. And you will find that our APTA group is very gracious with both technology and questions. So don't worry about any of that.
perfect. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, thanks for inviting me to present today. It's really such a pleasure. As you may or may not know, I'm actually Canadian and I've lived in the States for most of my life now. I came here for grad school, but I just love being around my Canadian colleagues. And so even though it's virtual, it's wonderful to be with you. So I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share some of what I've learned about sight reading with you. Um, and so I will share my screen with you right now, and I won't be able to see your questions, but Chelsea can. So there we go. Now let me make it. There we are. So if you can't see, I've tried to keep most things on my screen sort of a little lower, the important stuff, and to the left of the screen, but feel free to toggle around and change the view. You could, what's it called, Chelsea? Is it presenter view or something? Or you can even
Yeah,
hide me if you'd like.
gallery
Go
view.
ahead
And
and
I'm
hide
able
me.
to change that on their screens actually a bit too. So I'll try and make it
Oh,
lay out pretty well for them.
okay, well, whatever. I just want to remind everyone that you have that option there so that you, because I don't think you really need to see me. I gesture a lot and I make really dramatic faces, but but really, as long as you can hear me and see the information on the slides, I think that's the main thing. So, I've entitled today's session Strategies and Tips to Improve Student Success. This is what I've found from my own research, from my own studio, from learning from others. I'll speak mostly about intermediate level, and so I guess in my mind I'm thinking perhaps it could even be like a grade 3 through 7 or 8 even, sort of sight reading levels for what I discussed today. But I think it certainly applies to younger, or I mean more elementary students, and certainly to more advanced students. You would just want to just take some of these concepts a little bit farther. Okay, so as soon as I find my mouse, I will change the slide. So here's an overview of what I'd like to try to do today. Now, don't get scared with this first bullet point when I say brief review of recent research. Don't worry, I'm not going to pull out the big research articles. And as much as I'd love to kind of maybe fill you in on some of the research I have planned for the upcoming year, because I think some of it's exciting, we'll save that for question time if we have time. It's really about me sharing what I've learned, as I say, from my own teaching, but it's all based in research. And so there's quite a bit of work been done in reading, both language, but also in music sight reading. And so, there's some things I'd like to share with you from a perception standpoint, from a visual perception, from a cognition standpoint, without getting into the weeds too much, but just really about how we learn as human beings and how we perceive things, and then how we develop motor skills in music sort of associated with that. So really the beginning part of this presentation today, I'm going to be just kind of sharing some of this information with you, but again, hopefully in a way that is meaningful for us as piano teachers. And hopefully what I will have done is I will have convinced you that really working on having students do learning how to chunk, if you will, materials, and that's actually a term from cognitive psychology, but it's really about grouping information together. And then about drills we might have our students do, and this is really in the form of technique and other things, and how this can enhance sight reading ability. I was joking with Chelsea. I have here demonstrate motor skills, but once I decided not to sit at my piano and do the presentation, I won't be demonstrating these, but we'll be exploring how we develop those motor skills alongside the visual perception that's happening when we read music. And I suspect that you, like me, feel that there just aren't enough materials out there. So um, I hope to convince you that really it's not that tricky to either create your own materials, or to use things you're already using in your studio, but to then help students learn how to do some of these chunking drills and those sorts of things. And we'll end with exploring some materials that are already on the market. Now, this will not be an exhaustive exploration. I am going to really discuss lots of different things, some quite old actually, but older is not always older. Sometimes is better. And some of these materials may even be out of print, dare I say, but I know in our music teacher organization here in Louisiana, we have when we have our in-person conferences, and we too will return finally together this fall, we have a recycled music sale where we, can fill a paper bag full of other teachers' music. We all clean out our studios, we bring it in, we recycle music. And sometimes something that, one teacher is getting rid of because they don't use it anymore, I have actually found to be very helpful in my own studio for sight reading purposes. So maybe I'll give you a few things to think about there as well. So without any more hesitation, let's sort of talk about what sight reading is. And this is my favorite definition of sight reading. It's written by Andreas Lehmann, who is a well-known researcher in lots of musical areas having to do with cognition, memory, learning, sight reading especially, and Victoria MacArthur, who also did quite a bit of research, but she was a pianist as well. And this is their definition, and I really like it because I think it explains what sight reading is. It's the gap between each person's ordinary level of rehearsed performance and that same person's ability to perform at first sight, right? So let's say I have a student who's playing grade 9 materials. This is their performance spot, but maybe their sight reading, they can they're reading, they can read reasonably well and play reasonably well grade 1 material. So that gap is quite large. What we're hoping to do is lessen that gap, right? But that's what sight reading is. It's not that rehearsed performance. It's really looking at something for the first time and making enough meaning of it, and also having the associated motor skills developed that we can perform it with reasonable ease. So I also always like to return to Frances Clark. She really helped codify the piano pedagogy world for us in North America. And as many of you know, for many years at the back of Clavier magazine, she had the questions and answers section, and this is all now contained in the book Questions and Answers. But this came from, I think it was 1966. A piano teacher wrote in and said, I have a student, an advanced student, but he's a slow reader. And and Frances Clark, of course, very astutely said, well, can your student really be advanced if they are a slow reader? And her point was a good one, because what she was suggesting, without saying so, was that that gap was probably too wide. In other words, if the gap is too wide between the ability to read at first sight and then what we're working on for performance, we will have to spend a lot of time learning music, and then we may not be able to learn very much music in the course of a semester. So really what she was suggesting is that perhaps the student wasn't as advanced as the teacher would have hoped. Now, she also asked some other good questions here, and I think this is of value because I find myself asking this question when I am working with students and trying to develop their sight reading skills. So, are they noticing things that are the same and different in the music? Are they really, in other words, are they noticing patterns? But the bigger pattern as well, because again, at the intermediate level, a student might only be sight reading an 8 measure piece, or even a 16 measure piece. But if they see that it's, if there's an A phrase, a B phrase, the A phrase comes back again, and maybe there's a different ending, then that also decreases the difficulty level for the reading, because they're not having to take in so much. Clark also asked if the student understood the topography of the keyboard. And this has to do with just being comfortable with certain keys under the fingers, knowing where notes are, knowing what to expect. I like to think, about this. So when I have my students working on their technique, it's not just a scale for a scale's sake, but it's knowing what to expect. When they're sight reading a piece, they're probably not going to have the whole octave scale or 2 octave scale in their piece, but they could have a snippet of it. So then that will help them, if they recognize that and they know how it feels, they're not going to struggle with playing the notes under the fingers. But in addition, they'll choose appropriate fingering, which is also something that expert sight readers do. She asked if the student was looking ahead, and we're going to talk about this in a moment. Asked if the student was seeing groupings of notes or just reading single notes. And this, of course, is something that probably we all notice with students, and one of those things we're trying to get them to develop, which is why I'm going to spend quite a bit of time today discussing chunking of notes. Clark also asked if the student needed glasses, and I think this is important. And, I remember this from my own childhood. I would start learning pieces wrong when I needed my prescription increased for my glasses. But I certainly see it with my own students. I often know before the parent knows that the child needs glasses, because I either see them, leaning forward to look at notes or squinting, or as I just mentioned, they're just learning things incorrectly because they're just not seeing it correctly. Clark also asked if the student was technically prepared. And then she suggested that perhaps what the student needs is to do easier material, but it could be longer. Now, what she was getting at here, I may not talk about a lot today, but I think it's worth mentioning now. It's this notion that part of the way we make informed choices when we're sight reading, part of the way we problem solve, because we do have to problem solve and make educated guesses, is understanding different styles, different time periods, different stylistic features, if you will, in music. And if a student is only learning just a few pieces each semester or each year, they may not be encountering enough music to really become comfortable with, say, classical style, or to develop, let's say, comfort level with an Alberti bass pattern in the left hand, or even with romantic pieces. I mean, our students love playing music from the Romantic era. And, we all know that there are differences between Chopin and Liszt, and between, at the intermediate levels between Gurlitt and Bergmuller. But have our students picked up on some of these differences yet? And so this, I think, is something that we may overlook a little bit as well in our teaching. And it has an impact on sight reading, and we forget that from time to time. Now, I also, as I was preparing the presentation, went back and looked at Richard Chronister's writings, because he also worked with Francis Clark, was sort of the next generation, if you will, behind Clark. And he also wrote extensively about sight reading because, as I mentioned, this is a problem, a concern, I should say, that we all have as teachers, and this has not changed, and it probably will not change. But he suggested that sight reading is coping with unexpected change. It's playing the notes and rhythms and the dynamics that you know, but in a context that you haven't seen before. So, I just throw that out there for you to ponder and think about, especially with respect to that last bullet that I was just speaking about, in terms of just really understanding context a little bit. And later on, I'm going to sort of throw out this idea of sight reading flashes. And in some cases, this is what this is developing in a student as well, this ability to um, start recognizing patterns and developing the skill associated with the pattern, so that when they see it in a different context, they can replicate it. So essentially, sight reading involves these four things. It involves perception, seeing something on the page. And sometimes when I do this presentation, I put up a score here of a contemporary piece that was written just, within the past decade. And sometimes I'll put up an orchestral contemporary piece. So there may be, these techniques that we don't understand as pianists. We may not necessarily know what some of the suggestions a flute player would have to understand. But even some piano music, let's say it's music for prepared piano, we may not understand everything on the score. And I do that just to sort of highlight the point that we have to be able to decode this complex language of symbols. And that's really what perception is, but it's quite complex in music, right? Because even though there are only, a limited number of pitches, and there are a limited number of places where these could be on the staff, and a limited number of places where these could be on the piano, it's that the context changes a lot. And so it's quite a lot actually to unpack those patterns. So that's just the perception part. Then there's the kinesthetic part, where we have to execute the motor skills that are associated with those patterns. So again, it all sounds simple in one sense, but if you think about how long we've taken in our lives to develop these motor skills, and how long it takes our students, as they're developing skills and developing mastery over it, you can see how these are two complex things that we're asking the brain to do, actually. There's also memory involved, and this comes, I guess, in part from recognizing the patterns. I think that's the way I'd like to think of it today. Sometimes I spend quite a bit of time talking about working memory. I'm really not going to do that much today, but if we have time at the end and you have questions, we could talk more about that. But it really is remembering the patterns we've seen, and again, associating those patterns then with a motor skill. And so sometimes there's a disconnect there. If our students are having trouble with sight reading, it could be that. And I'm also going to suggest that there is a certain amount of problem solving that goes on with sight reading. And this is not my own, thing. This is something that really a lot of research has been done with expert sight readers. and with looking at not just where their eyes are on the page, but with having them watch video of themselves sight reading quite complex pieces, and then talking back and telling the researcher what they were thinking at the time. Of course, the thing with experts is that, and I think we should consider ourselves expert pianists because we're piano teachers, is that a lot of things that we do we've automatized. And so we've taken these very discrete, different things, and we clump them together, they become automatic. It becomes harder for us to recall what those discrete skills were. And our students, especially when it comes to sight reading, are at the very beginning working on these discrete skills. So, today really what I'd like to try to highlight is how we can help them automate and link some of these things together as well. So, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's been quite a bit of research done on visual perception in sight reading, in music sight reading in particular. And a lot of the focus has tended to be on eye-hand span. And this is very simply the distance between where the eyes are on the score and the note that's being played. So we know that the eyes are always ahead of the notes being sounded. And of course, this is the same in reading text as well, right? If you are reading a text aloud, your eyes have to be a little bit farther ahead. Otherwise, you don't have that flow with the sentence. And so it's the same with music. Now, again, with experts, what we tend to think is that they have a larger eye hand span, right? Their eyes are farther ahead than their fingers, we'll say, for pianists. But it turns out this isn't always the case. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But what the eye hand span does by looking ahead at least a little bit is it allows us to identify upcoming notes. So that's the first thing. It allows us to identify possible difficulties. And, just sort of think of something you might want to sight read yourself. It can be at an appropriate level, so a few levels below where you would be working on a piece, or think of a student you have. If they could just see what a difficulty might be, they could plan and prepare for it. That difficulty could be just an awkward fingering. Quite often with our intermediate students, it's just a leap that might happen, right? And again, if you know the leap is coming, you can plan for it. You can identify what that interval is. You know if you're going to use your thumb as a guide, for example. So all of this happens very quickly when we're sight reading well. But all of this to say it allows us to plan accordingly if we're looking a little bit ahead. So of course, with our students, this is why we often say, take a moment before you start sight reading and just study the score. And, if your students are like mine, sometimes they want to take forever, but this is where you can have some steps you take them through. And I will often have my students, tap the rhythm in their lap. And then I might have them shadow it on the keyboard, or some people call that ghosting. And what this might allow them to do is notice places where there is a difficulty. And I'm trying to help them start noticing things to be on the lookout for in the score, right? Things that could be problems, or things that they don't have to pay too much attention to. Oh, it's just moving by step here. It's D major. It's all under, my 5-finger pattern at this stage. So I don't have to focus and fixate on each one of those notes. I can now concentrate on maybe the dynamics, or maybe shaping my phrase, right? All of those things that we want our students to be able to do in sight reading. But if they're so fixated on just the notes themselves, they often don't get to that stage. Now, we know that eye hand span increases with our level of expertise. So I've just sort of already pointed out some of those things that would happen to help us become more expert, operating as more of an expert with sight reading, with looking ahead, predicting problem spots, knowing how we would solve the problem in real time. But here's the thing that's interesting, and it's when you see it written, you think, oh, of course. But it's true with experts as well that the eye handspan diminishes with more complex music. I see this at the intermediate levels when a student is reading a chorale or some sort of chorale style music, any of those sort of morning prayers by Gurlitt or, um, oh, now I've forgotten all my composers, but Bergmuller, I think, wrote one as well. But these things that are more like hymn like or chorale style, much harder to process, in part because you have to be playing all of those pitches at once. Now, again, if our students recognize the chords and they recognize the movement of the chord tones from one chord to the next, this can make it a little easier. If they remember that perhaps pedaling can help, so they can be moving their hands while the pedal holds the note, the chord through, that helps as well. But all of that to say, even if an expert sight reader is sight reading a Bach fugue for the first time, the eye handspan is significantly smaller than it would be in something that's easier. It also varies within contexts, as I've just been sort of sharing. Um, and I hand eye span, I can say this. It also varies depending on the context. So, I think we know this from musical context, but I would say this as well, to those of us who are preparing students for their exams right now. I would even put it in a more stressful context, right? So, when a student is doing their sight reading at the exam, even if they've been able to prepare it like, they can for their RCM exams right now, they have a little bit of time to prepare, it's still stressful. And so that's still going to cause some challenges with the perception and the motor skill execution. So it's important for us to remember this and give students lots of opportunity to practice in some of these simulated contexts, perhaps, or where they're getting immediate feedback. So, in a nutshell, if you can recognize the patterns and you can play the associated patterns, that can definitely help increase your hand-eye span. I've lost my mouse again. Here it is. Now, getting into just some specifics without really saying very much, um, the other thing that we talk about quite a bit, or that we see in research, is where the eyes actually are on the page. And there are these, if you ever do read some of this research, you'll see these two terms, the fovea and the paraphobia. And the fovea is where we are when we're focusing, and the paraphobia is more this peripheral. So yes, when a student's reading, they're peripherally probably seeing what's ahead of them, but it's really where their eyes are in focus. Now, the thing with this is that the eyes don't just, well, ideally, they don't fixate on one point. This is sometimes what happens with our students, right? They fixate on reading the pitches. This is a C, this is an E, this is a G. Whereas with more expert sight readers, when we look at where their eyes are, there is some, well, they're actually darting all around. These are called saccades, and they're so fast that we're not even aware we're doing this. We actually do this whenever we're looking at an image, or words, and we're, there's some looking ahead, some retrograde, up and down. And again, this changes in music on the context, upon the context as well. But here's where, if a student can see a C and an E and a G and recognize that, they're just a C chord, that's just a C chord, even if I'm playing one note after the other, it can help alleviate some of that fixating that happens. Now, I just put this like out of focus pushpin picture here for a reason, because even though it's out of focus and you can see there's even some peripheral thing here, you still know they're pushpins. And this is a picture I took of our tiger who lives on our campus, our mascot. His name is Mike. And, even within the picture, you can see, if you study it very carefully, it's actually, he's behind glass here. He's in his pool, but his nose is in focus. And everything else is a little bit out of focus. We can see his breath on the glass down here. Actually, his ears are very much out of focus, but yet you know they're ears. And in part, that's because of your experience with cats. Now, maybe you've seen a live tiger in person. You've probably seen pictures, you've seen videos of tigers, and you've had experience with, domesticated cats probably. And so there's an expectation that the cat's going to have these ears and they'll be pointy. So the whole thing doesn't need to be in focus is the point. And you already know what this is. It's a cat. You've labeled it. I mean, this is just how our human brains work, where we do try to categorize things. We try to label things, and we label them according to what we already know and our past experience. It's actually the same in music, right? So if we're trying to perceive more than just single pitches in music, it depends on our past experience, which is why an understanding of theory is so important. But it's also about contextualizing it in terms of our technique and those other skills we've developed as well. Now, this all has to do with Gestalt principles. And in this image here, everything's in focus here. Your eyes are jumping around again. It's happening so fast you don't realize it. But I think, these are all shapes and you recognize that. And so you can categorize those shapes, even though there are very few shapes that are complete. But they're shapes because of your past experience with shapes. You can see the triangles, the rectangles, the squares, the parallelograms. And these are called the principles of organization. And so what this does, again, it's how we perceive things, but it makes it easier for our brain to process. So most of us in the A example, rather than seeing individual lines, this is called the principle of proximity, we tend to see groups of lines or columns, if you will. I tend to see 4 thinner columns. Some people will see 3 thicker columns, but regardless, that's the brain just making meaning of seemingly random lines. In B, we tend to see the rows of O's and X's, right? And we're grouping them by similarity. These are similar, so those patterns are easier to see and make meaning of rather than looking at columns of, OX, 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 O. The C example here is a little trickier for some people. Most people tend to see continuous lines here. So you tend to see 2 lines that intersect rather than 4 V's. Now, the fact that they're a little wavy probably helps with that. That's called the principle of continuity. And D represents closure, which is what we were really looking at in the last slide. So even though these are 2 circles, even though one of them is not complete. But because of past experience and the brain just wants to make meaning of this rather than seeing it as some little kind of Pac-Man or partial moon kind of thing, we know there are 2 circles and we understand that. So finally, we get to look at music. You're thinking, yay. So just take a quick look at this. And if we were together, and this is where I sort of regret that we're not together and we're not able to share, but these would be some of the answers. Some of you would say, well, what do I see here? I see something that's in the key of G. It's only part of a piece. It's just a snippet of an example, but we can see it's in the key of G. And there are clues on the page to help us see that. Could be the key signature. Maybe you're seeing the chords, right? Maybe you're seeing, the second measure has a G chord. The first measure in this example, which is clearly probably not the first measure, this wouldn't be an entire piece. This is, 5-6-5 chord, a D7 chord, however you want to label it. And in a sense, it almost doesn't matter what you label it, just that it has meaning for you. And I would bet most of you now are not sitting at your keyboards, but in your lap, you could play it actually in your lap. You could shadow it in your lap, or you could put your left hand up and, cover even in the air the 5-6-5 chord, and then, resolve it to the G major chord in the second measure. And you definitely can probably hear in your mind how this sounds as well. Even if you don't have perfect pitch and you're not in the key of G, you would have it would be an excellent rendition. So all of this to say that these are the things that we see. But if you have a student sight reading this and they're fixating on, well, first of all, looking at it and going, oh no, look at all these, it's busy. The left hand has all these eighth notes, and the right hand isn't just quarter notes. There's some eighth notes and and this dotted quarter at the end, even though you and I might look at this and see, well, that's not a big deal. And there's an eighth rest there, but it just means we release a little early. Rhythmically, it could look complex to the student. And I think, I don't know if I do a very quick mathematical assessment, I think there are about 13 pitches in just the first measure alone. So if I'm looking at each one of those pitches and trying to identify them individually, it's going to take time. And then I have to find those on the keyboard. You can see how this is going to slow down my sight reading and make it not very effective. The other thing is we're limited, and I'll talk about that in how much we can process at once. So just as a recap, playing an instrument, but the piano in particular, involves perceiving and processing those visual cues and then executing those motor skills. And in our case, they're fine motor skills. So that's even more complex than just, say, tapping the rhythmic pattern, right? The correct finger has to play at the correct time. And because of the way the keyboard is organized, not all the keys are on the same plane. Now that's great. That's actually very helpful. It means we don't have to look at our hands lots of times because those black keys can help us know where we are. But it also means there are slight adjustments that have to be played because some of those keys depress at a slightly different, a little more easily, I'll say, than the shorter levers than the longer levers. So we make all of those adjustments, but when a student is sight reading, it's a lot to process all at once. So here are some pictures of just a couple of my students, right? So I have some college level students here. I have one of my former college students teaching one of her pre-college students. And I would suspect that your students look a lot like this. And my students today are quite busy. Piano is not the only thing they do. I wish my pre-college students had more time to practice, but they have what they have, and so we work with it. I wish my college students had more time to practice, for that matter. And I work a lot with non-piano majors as well as piano majors. And so I know the non-piano majors definitely want to spend more time on their own instruments, and yet they have to develop some fluency at the keyboard, right? So, these are just some of the things we're dealing with. And I say all of this because if you find that you are a good piano sight reader yourself, I guarantee you that you discovered all of these things that I've just talked about. You probably never had to name them and give voice to them. You just learned how to do that on your own. I don't think I was a particularly outstanding sight reader when I was younger, which I think is part of my fascination with the topic. I mean, I always did fine in my exams. I wasn't terrible, but I didn't actually enjoy sight reading because I loved perfecting music and I loved performing. And to me, that wasn't, sight reading wasn't part of that. So all of that to say that some of these skills I had to think a little bit more about as I became more advanced and needed to think about them differently. So again, our students don't need to understand all of those minuscule details, but they may need help learning how to chunk some of these patterns together. They may need extra drills to help them learn how to execute some of these skills in lots of different keys. Because as we know, sight reading is not all going to be in the key of C or G. So, it's really helping them to bring all of these disparate things together. So again, it's about knowing the keyboard topography. And that's where I will often, with many of these drills I'm going to show you now, have my students practice them in different keys. Many of their technical exercises that I give them, I will also have them transpose those to different keys. Because the thing with a lot of technical exercises is they can be memorized, and reading the notes isn't the big thing. It's really about being able to execute the skills. At some point, then I want them to see how that looks on the page so they can link a visual with what they've already learned how to do. And memory is a piece of that. It's remembering a pattern that they've seen in a different context later. So I won't belabor this point right now. If we were together, I would just, I'd take it away, and then I'd have a sort of, play on our lap what we were doing. And I guarantee you would get the articulation, you would really play it relatively well, even if I'd taken it away after probably 10 seconds. And here again, there's harmony implied in the left hand, but it's not the entire chord. And so it would also be helping students see this and sort of knowing what to expect harmony wise, and then not fixating on every single note. So if I look in measure 4, I'm not, well, I see that this is an ascending pattern, and I know that I've descended a third to get there. So I'm not even reading specific note names necessarily. I'd already discovered it's all within, a 5-finger hand position, so I don't have to move. And at that point, I have confidence that I can play these eighth notes that I'm just going up a step, and I've looked ahead, right? My hand eye span was far enough ahead that I could see that, oh, I was going back up to a D here, or I was headed to a D. Now, I might have guessed that I was headed to a D as well, right? That's part of it. And I would also notice that the first 3 measures are repeated again at the beginning of the second phrase. So these are also the kinds of things we'd want our students to be able to take in quite quickly, but that we might have to talk through with them a little bit, or get them to talk through, ask questions to see if they're really noticing the similarities and the differences. Okay, so I won't make you do that. But what I will say is working memory is limited. So working memory is just, it's really, it's what some people call short-term memory. It's where we're dealing with new information. It's kind of the desktop of our mind, if you will. And it's remarkably limited. There was this seminal research paper written in 1956, and there's been a lot of research on this ever since. But the paper was called, something along the lines of, working memory is 7 plus or minus 2. And all of that to say that we can only hold about 7 pieces of information in working memory at any given time. Now, we can train ourselves to hold more, but this is the trick, right? As experts, if we look at any of those examples we've looked at already, or think back to that earlier example where that first measure had 13 discrete notes there. But if you saw that the left hand was all just a 5-6-5 chord, now that's one piece of information rather than 4 different notes. And if you didn't recognize that they were 4 different notes repeated, maybe that would be 8. We might have already exceeded working memory capacity, is what I'm saying. Students don't know this, and they don't really need to know about working memory. But if we help them to understand that we can only deal with a very limited amount of information, so chunking that material together can be helpful, then they're more likely to buy into it. Okay, it's problem solving, not quite like doing the crossword, but again, how many times have you had your students sight reading for you in the studio? We get to ledger lines, and the eye fixates on the ledger line, and they lean in and they're counting down from the last note they know. But, if we know landmark C here, landmark low C, and we see they're pretty far apart, it's a line to a space, I'm going to make an educated guess that it's an octave. And then based on the context of the piece, I might know to expect that it would be an octave and not a seventh. And I'm just going to go for it. And my hand will go there and I know what I'm doing. That's problem solving, but it's educated, and it happens very quickly if we've had lots of experience with this type of problem solving. We can't problem solve, though, if we don't recognize musical patterns, if we don't develop the associated motor skills, and if we don't hone those reading skills. So this all has to do with consistency of practice. And I think I would bet everyone in this room today would agree with me, and that there needs to be enough time spent practicing. And, again, if you think back to the picture or your own students of our current students, um, and I know I did this when I was younger. My teacher would give me my 4-star sight reading, and I would just put it off. And the night before my lesson, I'd just plow through and read all of them. But there's actually quite a bit of data that would lend itself to the fact that if I did 60 minutes of sight reading the night before, that's going to be less effective than if I did just 10 minutes a day, even just 5 days throughout the week. I'm going to retain it more. And we can tell our students that. It also makes it more manageable, right? I don't have to sight read for 60 whole minutes. I can just spend 10 minutes a day. That's doable. But still, human nature is what it is. Now, I often show my students various versions of this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. You can Google this, you can get all kinds of charts, but look on the left at how quickly memory decays after we've learned. I mean, this applies to repertoire too, for that matter. But after 20 minutes, look at how much we've forgotten. And after an hour, and after 9 hours, and after a day, we've forgotten more than half of what we've learned. So that's a little scary. But the good news is that on this chart here on the right-hand side of your screen, so the decay is, precipitous. But if I go back on the second day and I review that same material for the repertoire, or review my sight reading skills or my technical skills or whatever it is, the learning still decays, but it's not as much. The decline is less. And after the third day, there's even less decay. And after the fourth day, less decay still, meaning we remember it. Now, again, we all know this intuitively just from our own learning and our own memory when we're working on music. And your students may know it as well, but somehow seeing these visuals, it can help, for many of my students, help them buy into this a little bit of consistent time spent at sight reading or practicing really can help in the long run. And it's part of the reason why, I can practice and cram a little bit for my lesson, but it will be better if I just spread it out over the week. I'm going to remember it better. So what I've found, though, is I can sort of try to help my students start seeing things chunking, seeing chords. So this is an example of a chord chunk. And this might be an example of a piece I'd like them to sight read eventually. And I've actually done studies with this where I've given students these things to look at by themselves. But if they've had the chunking drills ahead of time, they are much more effective in their sight playing of an example. Even later on, right? And it didn't take a lot of time. It took about 5 minutes, in fact, 2 days out of a week, over a period of 3 weeks for these chunking drills to have helped. I did them in lots of different keys. And I didn't start by just giving them this and saying, see the chords. Even though for us, it's relatively easy to see those chords, that's still challenging for some students if they're trying to read the notes. So I created drills for them. The drills might have looked like this without all the, the circles and stuff on it at first. So I might have given them a drill to practice in the key of G, where they were doing the chords. I might have had them do this separate hands first. And I asked them to sort of, for my students, we put lines noting where the movement is. Other studios, it works to put a line, up with the common tone between the chords. But I really wanted them to see this. I also wanted them to be doing their correct fingering. So some of them had to circle fingering, that kind of thing. I could create the drill, and again, it wouldn't take very long to play this, but I wanted them to be developing the skill and understanding, at least, from a perceptual standpoint, of really what was moving and what was staying the same. And then I gave them a drill where now you can see they're actually doing the harmonic rhythm of the piece that eventually they'll see. Now, I had them then transpose these drills. I would say, so I will say, I sometimes, and I just have these drills that I can either pull up on an iPad that we can do in a lesson, or I have paper copies that students can write on. So it sort of depends on the student, frankly. And then I can reuse them. So in Finale, it's relatively easy then to just take a drill, save a copy of it, put it in a different key. So I might also give them this in the key of D and A if we're working on these keys. And then, have them be able to identify it. But at a certain point, I want them to kind of see what this drill looks like in the key of G, because that's what they're going to see eventually in the piece. Then I would give them the piece and actually ask them to circle the chord chunks, because that visual helps focus the eyes. That way they A, don't get fixated, and B, it's helping them now to see, oh, I don't need to worry about the whole thing. Now, again, eventually you might circle the whole measure, right? Because it's really the same chord in the whole measure, in most of these. But even at the very beginning, just chunking 3 notes together to see a chord lessens the load on working memory. I will have my students then write in, because again, I think that writing it in allows them to slow down and process it a little more deeply. It could be the chord names or the, sort of the lead line symbols as you see here, or it could be the Roman numerals. And the Roman numerals are much more helpful, obviously, when you're having them transpose something. And if they're learning that in their theory anyway, then it's a good application at the piano of their theory. But whatever is going to be helpful for the student. So I actually have them do this, and then we might put it away. And at the next lesson, I might take it out and just have them review it without the chunks there. And I try to keep an eye on where their eyes are, just to help them look ahead. But it helps me to know how much more drilling we need to do. Now, this is another example of some chunking drills that I created. This one's a little different in that the right hand has this is the actual sight reading example, but there's obviously a melody here. Still chords in the left hand, they're broken chords still. The rhythmic pattern is not complex in the left, but it's a little more complicated in the right. Now, the good news is that it's that same pattern, right, that comes back 3 times, and you would hope they would see the whole rhythmic pattern. But this is where the rhythm drills can be excellent. So same thing. I just, before they even see this example, I've had them practice these rhythmic drills where they're tapping single hand, and then 1B, 1C is especially important because now they have to really get the coordination between the hands, but they're doing it with the gross motor skills first before they have to do fine motor skills of specific notes. So those rhythmic patterns can be really helpful. And my students know that it's not just like a single repeat. They repeat it over and over and over till it's comfortable, and comfortable at different speeds. I might also give them, a pitch pattern chunk for them to do here. And so for the left hand, it could be like this. And again, where they would write in, or together we'd figure out what the chord was. They would do the broken chord and then follow it with the solid chord. I could also give them sort of the basic outline of the melody here too. And this is just what I decided to make that basic outline in 1B, so that they're really just getting a sense of noticing where the stepwise motion is and where there are a few small little leaps. Then I could also have them work on something like 1C, which is playing the block chords and playing the basic outline of the melody. I like to then take something like this, where 1D, where they're still blocking the left hand. So that's, again, reinforcing that chunking. But then, we sort of circle, okay, so what are our main melody notes? And it gives us a chance to talk about, embellishments in a melody and upper neighbors and all of that stuff they're learning in theory, and they will be learning it at the intermediate levels, but now it's even a little more simplistic, so that they realize, oh, I don't have to focus on every single one of those notes. I mean, they may be looking at the intervals, but really if I just get those main pitches on the beat in this example, I'm set, I'm good to go. And that can also give them then a little bit more confidence if they do happen to play a wrong note. Just when we say keep going, it's so hard to do, because when we hear a wrong pitch, we want to correct it, we just want to fix it, our students especially. So and this is how it could look on the page. For some students, I might skip that step with the blocking the left hand. Most of my students are used to blocking anyway, so they wouldn't need to see the blocked chords. They would be able to just block this and do it. But sort of giving them this permission, if you will, to just sort of see these embellishments and see them then in the rhythm that's there, the rhythm that's actually shown. Okay, this is sort of another example where I was going to elucidate a little more, but I'm just going to sort of skip on through so we can get to some more of the materials. But you can see now there are bigger leaps here. The left hand has a slightly different rhythmic pattern, but it is predictable. And the right hand has a few eighth notes in here, which again, our students sometimes panic about. But if they see that these are just, they're just passing tones, essentially, they're just filling in some of the basic melody notes, that can be helpful. And so, use what works with your students. It might just be, for me, sometimes it's we just take the pencil and we sort of trace the contour of the line of the melody. Sometimes it might mean reminding ourselves, oh, yep, sharp coming, sharp coming. And then looking at what fingering actually is going to be ideal here. Maybe I want to put, if I have 5 on the C, it makes more sense to put the 1 on the F sharp, even though that's going to cause a little, so you can work through that with your students so that they come up with a fingering that works for them. So again, this wouldn't happen in the actual sight reading itself, but these are some drills I've created for students so that they have time to sort of work through, what do I do when I come up with some of these tricky situations? And then helping them to see chords, obviously. I can't, again, stress enough how I might also then have a student take this once they've sight read it, and I may say, take it home with you this week, and I'd like you to transpose it to some different keys. Play it in the key of C, the key of E, and the key of F, maybe even, right? So that they start getting comfortable with that. And I don't shy away from, D flat and A flat major, especially when they're sight reading, because remember, their sight readings ultimately 2 levels below their level of repertoire. So often those sight reading examples are in 5-finger positions at the intermediate levels until they become a little bit more advanced, or just slightly extended, right? Extended a 6th. And so where there might be a crossover with 1 finger in the melody, and the left hand might just be extending as well. But these, it's helpful for a student to start transposing these and being able to see the pattern and knowing how that feels in different keys. So, where do you find these examples, right? Because I've already said my students do kind of need more than we have in the books. I find that the classical era sonatinas, the sonatas as they become more advanced, the dance movements are a great source of this, because they do have sort of predictable left-hand harmonic progressions. They're not terribly complex, but it matches what they're learning in other in other areas, their theory and their technique and that sort of thing. So that's always a good place to start. Some of the again, the teaching pieces are helpful, and we'll talk about that again in a few more minutes. But pieces that have typical accompaniment patterns. So I want my students to be developing broken chord accompaniments, waltz bass that eventually turns into jump bass, Alberti bass, certainly, so that the the motor skill becomes automated. They will recognize the pattern, but then the motor skill is automated. And as I say, choosing the appropriate level is really important. Um, and I do find that using repertoire anthologies or etude books can be really helpful because oftentimes they're focusing on these things as well and encouraging the student to mark their own score because that's going to help them make more meaning of it if it's needed. I'm going to skip over this. So I was just going to illustrate this with one of the Diabelli sonatinas, but I believe you know what I'm talking about. So I use Finale to create these drills, but you can use whatever software you're comfortable with. I do pay for sort of an upgraded version because it just gives me more flexibility in transposing and doing those kinds of things. Um, and I will say, it's expensive, but it's one of those studio expenses that it's worth it. I don't upgrade every year. It seems like Finale, as they're on version 27 here now, it is expensive to upgrade, but about every 2 years I find I have to because it stops working, effectively and efficiently. But what I have then is on my computer, this whole sort of collection of files that I can use with any student. And what I always share with teachers is, if it feels overwhelming to create your own drills, well, choose one student at, maybe they're a level, a grade 4 student. So I'm going to create, I'm going to find some examples I want them to sight read throughout, if not even the whole semester, maybe a month. Maybe we're going to take a month and we're going to really spend time in every lesson on sight reading. And it only has to be 5 minutes to do those drills and to go through those things. And it can certainly be sequenced with the rest of your lesson. But then create the drills that you would need for that one student for that month, 4 lessons worth or more lessons if you'd like. And then chances are you can use those drills with another student because you probably have another grade 4 student who's going to need similar sight reading. And if not now, next year you will. So you can certainly reuse these things. But then within your teacher groups, work together, right? Maybe one person wants to work on some sight reading drills for like sight reading at level 2. Maybe someone else wants to do level 3. Or maybe you all say, no, let's all work on level 2 sight reading drills, but let's sort of just divide and conquer and, divide up the pieces and the drills you're going to create. And then if you share those, imagine the enormous library of drills that you have, not to mention you've identified some useful pieces for sight reading too. I do a lot of sight reading flashes. And so so again, some of these I do, I'll use Finale to create them. And so these might be flashes I would have a student do throughout the week. And just because at the lesson, I might want them to play this Kohler excerpt for me. And they wouldn't get all of these flashes all at once, but what they would get are, they would get one of these squares and they'd have to do it. And I will often put them in electronically. So, and we can do them at the lesson too. I will say students like to do that. So they could be on the iPad and they could just be scrolling through. So they're timed, or the student can do each one. I like the timed ones because it adds to the game-like quality of it. But again, they won't be able to complete it in time if if they're not seeing those chunks. You can also do this, what I call the old-fashioned way, where you just literally, in this case, photocopy the piece because you're going to cut it up. And we would pull, the student pulls it out of an envelope. And I still do that with some of my students who are much more tactile and kinesthetic. And they love that. It's fun for them to pull the measure out of the envelope. And they know that it's out of context, but they know that they also have seen these things before. They recognize the chords, and then they have to play it for me as fast as I can. Sometimes I show them the chunk for 3 seconds, I'll take it away and they have to play it from memory. So developing that memory skill as well. Okay, that was an example. There's also guided practice software that is helpful. I like Home Concert Extreme because it's not terribly expensive. I want to say $69 US, it might be 79, but I actually just have it in my studio. And so students can come in and on their own time, or, and lots of teachers do this, students come 10 minutes early and they set up at their station and they go through the sight reading drills. The thing I like about this is that you can put it in what's called jam mode, and it doesn't stop and wait for the student. That is another mode. But it has backing tracks, so it helps the student internalize a sense of pulse, but it also highlights a measure at a time. So that helps direct the student's eye to where the eye needs to be. Of course, there are other kinds of software that I don't have on slides here that give the student immediate feedback. And this will do that. And it certainly can do that in some of the other modes. Yeah, there are any number of programs out there. So JoyTunes has a good one, and now it's escaped me the other one that's excellent for sight reading, where you have a teacher package and your students all go in, they do this on their own time. I'll think of it after during question time. And they get the feedback. They know where they made the mistakes. So that's immediate. That can help them then correct errors. But you also see that A, they've done their sight reading, and that B, how they're scoring. So you can see if there's improvement or not. And these are graded, of course. Okay. So Glover, some of you may still use Glover. I do not. And I have to say, it's just not a method I use anymore. There's a newer Glover on the market than this one, but this is an example of one of those books that I picked up at our recycled music sale several years back. And I thought I almost passed it over. And then I saw, oh, sight reading and ear training, who can't use more of that? And so I pulled it up, and it turns out that you don't need to be using this method. It's just another excellent reference and source of materials. And so, I just pulled 2 random pages, and these are, again, this is probably more elementary sight reading, if you will, but there are things in here, activities that get students, listening to intervals or finding intervals or creating intervals. But then it also has these shorter flashes, which you see on page 6 here on the right hand side, because apparently 6 comes after 7 in my book. But where they have to identify intervals and then play them. And so it's the kinesthetic, it's the visual, it's the auditory, they're hearing it as well. You see there's some pattern flashes really having to do with rhythm and pitch, and you see that they cover different keys. The bastions also, again, these are very old resources, but they have 4 levels of sight reading. The first ones are quite elementary, but I will say where they can be useful is that there was an emphasis, as you probably know, on chords, which, for many of our young students, that's just not helping them develop good technique necessarily, but great for sight reading. So there are 4 levels of this particular sight reading. They have 2 different versions, and you can see short, so they're doable, in different but limited keys, right? So within each book, you probably have about 3 to 5 to 6 keys, but they're interspersed. And students would be able to do these fairly quickly, or you can use them as resource materials, in your studio. And here's the other one, which is line a day, also 4 levels. There's one that we have in our our pedagogy library. This one is, I find helpful. You'll notice it's very text heavy, right? So I have certain students, I would never have them do this on their own, because I promise, would not follow all of those steps and follow all of those instructions. But for those who are very process oriented and would do it, it really takes them through a nice set of skills. As you know, in the newer methods, there are still some sight reading books, but they tend to embed the sight reading materials. In this particular one, in Alfred's Premier, there's sight reading flashes that you'll see in the book, and I can't remember if I actually showed you an example. I don't think I did. They also have them in the theory book. What I find Well, the philosophy is that they're short, they do relate to the music that is upcoming for the student, so it's practical and they will be seeing it again. I find it's not enough sight reading, frankly, so they still need more experience through other resources. Oh, I did put it here so you can see the flashes. And, here, sight reading flash one relates directly to what's coming up in this piece. Um, and the others relate to what's going to be in their performance book and the next piece in the book. And then just sort of showing you what's in the theory book and how really they're meant to play it and do the sight reading in there as well. This is probably no longer a newer method, but it's another example. It's this piano for busy teens, where the sight reading is embedded in each unit. But I will, again, they will do it, but my contention is that it's not going to be enough sight reading to probably make an appreciable difference in their level of sight reading. But you can see how these look, and it certainly, because the students would be a little older, it gives them some autonomy in keeping track of how they're doing it and what they're practicing. There are certainly other sight reading resources. This is not comprehensive or at all, but I like this one because I think there are 3 levels or 3 books, and they have different folk songs in there, and we have to be careful that the folk songs are titled appropriately and whatnot. We want to be careful with that, but it certainly does help students learn about and hear melodies from other cultures, and it also has some flashes and things for them to do in there as well. Okay, so we will move right along. For me, by far, when I'm looking for additional examples, those etude books, this is Jane McGraw's Technical Skills. You can use Keith Snell's, you can use RCM etude books. There are so many excellent short etudes in here. Again, choose a couple of levels below, or wherever your student needs. If your student is 3 levels below in their sight reading, then choose that. But generally, there's a wealth of information, and it's good source material for you. You could take some of these, and rather than have the student read the whole etude, maybe you do just 8 measures in this example. Or it could be, I have a lending library from my pre-college students, and so they check out books, and I keep track of that, and they just work their way through. Because some of my friends who were the best sight readers, their moms were very smart. They just used to leave music on the piano. These were friends who didn't like to practice a lot, but they like to play. And so they would leave appropriately leveled music on the piano, and they would change out these anthologies every so often. And, it took my friends some time to realize what was happening, but they were learning how to sight read just because they were experiencing all of this material, right? And that's the point. And these are real pieces by real composers, pedagogical composers or otherwise. And so they're learning about the context and the musical style. These are probably my top 3 picks right now, but I could be convinced of others as well. But I love the sight reading and rhythm every day. Very similar to the 4-star in that you have sort of 5 days of practice. There are rhythm drills, there are suggestions for things to do, and then there's a lesson day where often in sight reading every day, it's a duet that the student will play with the teacher. So, you get to play with them. Improve Your Sight Reading is by Paul Harris, by Faber Music in the UK. There are 8 levels in this, I think, altogether. There's an older edition, but the newer one is quite a lot better. I might have a couple of screenshots. I won't bore you with 4-star because I assume you know that one really well. Here is just a screenshot of Rhythm and Reading Every Day. Or Reading and Rhythm Every Day. She does some lead lines in here too, which, in the more upper level, which again now helps you, sequence and work with your students to help them develop those skills, chunking, all that stuff we've been talking about. And there are also lovely review pages at the back, just like with 4 Star. So you have additional examples. And here is, I wish I could remember what I pulled this from, which level this is from. I'm really sorry. I want to say it might be level 2. I think yeah, I'm not sure. It's one of the earlier levels from Improve Your Sight Reading. But you can see very clean pages. They do have suggestions. This is a more advanced level, but there are rhythmic exercises, and then just like 4 Star, the student checks off when they've done it, that sort of thing. So this is sort of where I'll open this up for questions and suggestions, and love to hear your comments. And I have a number of my former students in here of all ages, because regardless of the age or the level, it is about the better we can sight read, the more approachable music is, even the music we're working on. And I have to share with you the little boy in the bottom there in the bottom right hand corner is my husband back in the 70s, maybe no 60s, when he was young. And he really doesn't play the piano very much anymore, but I consider him to be a reasonable sight reader. If you give him the right level of music, it can't be too hard. But he loved playing, and I don't think he loved performing. And he certainly never did exams, and even the recitals, he was not the star of his studio. There were 2 other people his age who became pianists, like concert pianists. And so, he's sort of your typical student, but he has this huge appreciation for music, obviously, and he puts up with a lot of it in the house here. But he can still sit down and play even after really not playing a lot throughout his life. And I think it speaks to the fact that he does recognize patterns, and he does still remember the topography of the keyboard. And he's a good problem solver. So that's my little personal story here. So my email address is here at the bottom, pdpike@lsu.edu. If you have questions, things you're working on after the fact, after today's webinar is over, feel free to reach out. I do love talking to people. Just I ask you to be a little patient with email right now. It's the busy time of year for me, and it seems like email has just exploded. So be patient if you don't hear back right away, but I would love to sort of talk with you some more. So I have stopped sharing my screen, and I see there's been a little bit in the chat.
Yeah, I put quite a few things in throughout, just thoughts I had throughout too. And feel free, for those of you watching, to put any questions in the chat. I have a question to start us off. I really enjoyed and found it compelling when you talked about the gap between playing ability and reading ability. And I found for some of my students, especially with the dawn of YouTube tutorials, that sometimes that gap can widen quite quickly. Especially, even I found it with a student over the summer who just did a ton of playing, but not reading. And so I'm curious if you see that happening too, and how you encourage them to help bring that sight reading part or close
Yeah,
that gap a bit.
so you're right. Some of these online programs are very helpful that way.
Yeah.
And I definitely, and it's also something they're doing then outside of the lesson.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
keeping them engaged. And
Totally.
again, they may not be practicing their pieces, but they're learning important skills, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it is about an awareness of the eye. And I find I just have to remind them quite a lot,
Yeah.
but the flash, for me, the flashes help a lot, because, and it is a fun game when we do flashes and I take it away, and I do this in my groups quite a bit, actually, because then it's it's a good use of time.
Yeah.
But they all feel it to be more of a game this way, and they do start getting better at taking in all of that information very quickly. And so then I can lessen the time they see the flash. And I think as long as we keep it light. And then what I find is then when they start, there's a recognition that happens where they start seeing these patterns and they realize, oh, I am seeing it. I don't need to look at that anymore. Like when it dawns on them, and sometimes they'll say it, and sometimes you just see the smile on their face. But it comes with consistency, So the other thing I will say is, I even find that with whether it's sight reading and rhythm every day or 4-star, that just doing one of those a day is not enough.
Yeah.
So even with some of my students, I mean, I keep some of the older 4-star, like all of the older 4-star editions in my library, and I'll lend those out to students. And I will say, just take this book and, read through whatever feels reasonable for you each day. It might be 2, it might be 3, it might be 4. Maybe you do a whole week in a day, but really go through the exercises. And you're not going to feel like it's improving. And especially with my older students, like my teenagers and even my college age adults who are just intermediate and learning and wanting to read better. And I'll say, I promise you, you're not going to feel like you're improving. But after you get through about 2 books, I think you will start noticing the difference. And they do. I mean, it really is kind of amazing. But it also sometimes is about us then backing up and doing an easier example and saying, now, notice what you're looking at, notice where your eyes are, and notice how much it's improved.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know if that really answers your
No,
question,
I
but
think that's
I will
helpful.
say these online, whether it's, programs you're using or something that's good on YouTube, and there's a lot of great stuff now that we can vet for our students. That's probably as helpful as anything, and it's sort of like, back 20 years ago when we said play with backing tracks, and that's again what a lot of these do.
Yeah.
The backing tracks are there for the student, and so it helps with the continuity. But I will say the rhythmic piece of this is important. The rhythm, it's about making sure they see rhythm patterns, because it's true. I mean, so much of the way we teach rhythm, and they do have to be able to understand how it all lines up and where it fits. But in the end, it's a pattern. It's not about being able to do that individual eighth note. It's knowing how that eighth note connects to the dotted quarter that came before it, and feeling it. So yes, it's important to be able to, tap a quarter note and still tap your dotted quarter eighth rhythm. And it's important to be able to count that, but you need to be able to do it and just have it internalized so it's there.
Yeah. No, I think that's huge. I think for me, that takeaway of consistency, even in the small little chunks, right? But consistency. And just the acknowledgement that sometimes what's in the method books we're using is not enough.
It absolutely isn't, right? And this is why I really came to this point where I just started creating my own, and then I did actual proper research studies to see, is this really making a difference? And really within 3 weeks it can. And if they have a little bit more ownership in helping to identify the chunks and that sort of thing, it helps that process move faster, I think.
Right.
Some of them will get there on their own, but for most of them, they need our help because they're just, there are too many other things competing for their time and attention. Let me just put it that way. And I will say, I always share this with teachers too. It's it's very powerful what we convey about our priorities based on what we do in a lesson. And if we don't do the sight reading in the lesson, what the student can take away from that is it's not important. And it really doesn't take very long. I mean, sequenced well, if you have your drills ready to go, even 5 minutes would be longer than it really takes. But just that consistency within the lesson. Now, I mean, the benefit then of the online things is that it's even more consistent. It's, maybe they do it 3 times throughout the week, if not every day.
Yeah. That's a really good word. I think that's actually a beautiful way to wrap up today too, is that idea of our lessons reflecting our priorities. That certainly makes me think a little bit about what am I putting in that half hour, 45 or hour I've got with students. And maybe that's a good challenge for our APTA members too, is to think about, do our lessons in their practicality reflect our priorities and our hopes and dreams for our students too. So while I wrap up here, APTA members, if there's any last questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. But I just want to thank you so much for your generosity of your time and knowledge and research with us, Dr. Pike. It's been so wonderful to hear from you and to feel energized again and inspired again to keep at it, keep at that sight reading with our students. And we're just so thankful for your time. And APTA members, as I said, we are planning for an in-person conference end of September, the 23rd, 24th, so you can mark your calendars and you will hear more information about May's webinar in your emails in the next couple of weeks. So I don't see anything else popping up into the chat. So with that, we will just offer you our heartiest thanks and wish you just a great end to your semester. And AFTA members as well, we wish you a great festival and exam and April season. I don't know about you, but it is snowing where I am. So
Oh, no. Well, it is not snowing where I am. I want to thank you all so much for taking time to be here. And I look forward to the day when I can see you all in person.
Oh, we would love for that to happen again. Thank you so much, Dr. Pipe. Have an awesome week, everyone. Happy weekend. Bye.